Okay, so here's a question I want you to sit with for just a moment. What if a single patch of Canadian land held enough aluminum to keep the entire world supplied for longer than recorded human history? And what if almost nobody outside a few boardrooms and government offices is actually talking about it yet? Because that's essentially what we're dealing with right now. And the more you dig into the details, the harder it becomes to look away. Just outside a small Saskatchewan town called Tisdale, a company called Canadian Energy Metals made an announcement that, on the surface, sounded like any other mining press release. But once people started reading past the headline and actually engaging with the numbers, the reaction shifted from mild interest to something closer to disbelief. Early estimates are pointing to roughly 6.8 billion tons of alumina-bearing material sitting in the ground there, and that's part of an even larger cluster of critical minerals estimated at around 50 billion tons total, including scandium and vanadium. Now, if those figures feel abstract, just hold on, because by the time we're done walking through what they actually mean in practice, they're going to feel very, very real. The company has named this thing Project Thor, and honestly, once you understand the scope, the dramatic name starts to feel almost understated. The CEO, Christopher Hopkins, has been pretty upfront about the fact that this isn't just a large deposit competing with other large deposits. He's describing it as something structurally and geologically different from anything currently on the map. And when Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe starts drawing comparisons to the province's potash industry, which is already a multi-billion-dollar global operation, you get a sense that the people closest to this information are not treating it as a routine discovery. To really grasp why this is such a big deal, you have to understand where aluminum normally comes from and why that process has always been a problem. Most of the world's aluminum starts as bauxite, a reddish tropical ore found in places like Australia, Guinea, and Brazil, and refining it is not exactly a clean operation. The traditional method, called the Bayer process, is energy-intensive, chemically demanding, and generates enormous amounts of toxic red mud waste that ends up stored in massive tailings ponds. It's messy, it's expensive, and it carries a significant environmental cost that the industry has been trying to reduce for decades. What makes the Tisdale deposit unusual is that it's not bauxite at all. It's polymetal black shale, sitting at relatively shallow depths, somewhere between 20 and 50 meters below the surface. And according to Hopkins, that difference changes nearly everything about how the material can be extracted and processed. The company claims it can use a method that consumes far less energy than conventional refining, while producing significantly fewer environmental side effects. And in a world where governments, corporations, and consumers are all paying close attention to the carbon footprint of industrial materials, that's not a minor footnote. That's potentially a massive competitive advantage. Canada's aluminum sector already benefits from one of the lowest carbon footprints in the world because so much of its electricity comes from hydroelectric sources. Pair that existing advantage with a deposit that can reportedly be processed more cleanly than bauxite. And Hopkins isn't exaggerating when he talks about the potential to market this as genuinely green aluminum. That framing could reshape long-term supply contracts, trade relationships, and how entire industries approach their sourcing decisions over the next several decades. But here's the number that really makes people stop mid-sentence. Based on early projections, this deposit could support mining at a rate of 50,000 tons per day for more than 2,000 years, not 200, 2,000. For context, most mines are designed around operational lifespans of somewhere between 20 and 50 years, with exceptional cases occasionally pushing toward a century. When you're talking about 2,000 years, you're essentially saying this resource outlives companies, outlives trade agreements, and potentially outlives entire economic systems as we currently understand them. It stops being a mining project and starts looking more like a permanent geological fact of life embedded in the global supply chain. When those numbers get translated into financial models, things get interesting pretty fast. Preliminary assessments are putting the internal rate of return at around 72% after tax, alongside a net present value of approximately $72.3 billion US, discounted at 10%. The projected initial capital expenditure comes in around $6.3 billion, with annual operating costs of roughly $1.66 billion. Chemical-grade alumina is priced in the model at around $5,000 per ton, while high-purity alumina sits at around $25,000 per ton. And over a modeled 25-year operational window, the project is expected to produce about 1.88 million tons of aluminum annually from 16.5 million tons of ore per year. These are projections. The company has been clear about that, and the resource hasn't yet been formally classified as proven reserves. But even as early-stage estimates, figures like these attract a very different caliber of attention than a typical junior mining announcement. And the reason for that attention goes well beyond Saskatchewan, because aluminum isn't a niche industrial material. It's in electric vehicles, aircraft, power lines, construction materials, packaging, and the infrastructure being built right now to support the global transition to renewable energy. Hopkins put it simply when he described aluminum as something that shows up in anything that moves, anything that transmits power, and anything that stores energy. Demand isn't leveling off. If anything, electrification is accelerating it, and the industries that depend most heavily on aluminum are precisely the ones that are expanding fastest, which is where the geopolitical piece comes in, because a significant chunk of the global aluminum supply chain currently runs through China, either directly or via Chinese-controlled processing operations. That concentration has been a concern for Western governments for years, and recent disruptions to global supply chains have made those concerns much more urgent. Canada currently accounts for somewhere around 3 to 4% of global aluminum production, which is meaningful but not remotely dominant. A fully developed Thor project would change that arithmetic considerably, potentially positioning Canada as a primary alumina source for North America and allied markets at a time when those relationships are under more strain than they've been in decades. And the infrastructure picture in Saskatchewan actually makes this more feasible than it might otherwise be. The property sits alongside both CN and CPKC rail lines, which, according to Hopkins, are capable of moving virtually any volume to either coast. There's existing natural gas and electrical transmission infrastructure already in place, and nearby hydroelectric capacity totaling 544 megawatts near Nipawin. That combination of factors removes several of the logistical barriers that typically slow down projects at this scale, and it's one of the reasons local and provincial leaders are speaking in terms that go well beyond cautious optimism. Tisdale's mayor has described this as placing the region at the forefront of Canada's critical mineral supply chain. Premier Moe, as mentioned, has drawn the potash comparison directly, and that matters because potash became globally significant specifically because of how concentrated the reserves were and how central the commodity became to world agriculture. Aluminum, given its role across transportation, defense, construction, and energy, could follow that same trajectory if a single region ends up holding a disproportionately large and accessible share of supply. But there's a question that doesn't get answered in any press release, and Hopkins himself has pointed to it openly. A deposit this size is almost certainly too large for Canadian Energy Metals to develop on its own, which means the next chapter here probably involves major global players stepping in with capital commitments large enough to reshape the trajectory of the project and potentially the entire industry around it. That's not a criticism. It's just the reality of how projects at this scale tend to evolve. And whoever steps in brings their own interests, their own priorities, and their own influence over how the resource gets developed and who benefits from it. That feeds directly into the tension that's already building around Canadian resource policy. Because at the same moment this discovery is generating momentum, Prime Minister Mark Carney has been making deliberate public statements about how Canada intends to handle its energy and critical minerals in trade negotiations. His position is clear. Canada is not interested in using its resources as bargaining chips. He's pushed back explicitly against the idea that aluminum or energy should function as leverage in disputes with the United States, emphasizing instead that Canada honors its contracts and maintains its commitments. But he's also raised a more nuanced question about whether deeper integration with the U.S. in these sectors actually serves Canada's long-term strategic interests, especially at a moment when those very resources are being framed in Washington as strategic pressure points. That tension matters because it sits right at the heart of how Thor will ultimately be developed, financed, and integrated into global trade. And it's not just philosophical. The United States imposed Section 232 tariffs of up to 50% on Canadian aluminum imports as of June 2025, a move that didn't just raise costs but redirected large volumes of Canadian exports toward Europe and other markets. That kind of disruption to what had been one of the most integrated cross-border supply relationships in the industrial world adds urgency to the question of what a project like Thor means for the future of that relationship. U.S. industries need aluminum at scale. Automotive manufacturing depends on it for vehicle frames and EV battery systems. Aerospace depends on it for structural integrity. Defense depends on it. The electrical grid expansion being built to support renewable energy depends on it. And when you connect that demand with what might be sitting in Saskatchewan, you can see why this is being analyzed through a geopolitical lens and not just a commercial one. Because if even a portion of these projections hold, the Thor project could reduce North America's reliance on overseas bauxite and alumina sources in a way that fundamentally changes the dependency structure of some of the world's most critical industries. Canada's Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson has described the country's resources sector as one of its strongest cards in trade discussions. Carney has acknowledged that dealing with the current U.S. administration requires directness, describing Trump as a tough negotiator who responds to clarity. And with CUSMA review discussions approaching, where energy and critical minerals are expected to be central to the agenda, the way Canada chooses to handle assets like this one could shape North American trade relationships for a generation. What makes all of this so compelling right now is precisely the fact that so much of it is still unsettled. The geology is established, the scale is real, but everything built around it, the ownership, the processing technology, the trade agreements, the political decisions, all of it is still in motion. And that's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the gap between what exists underground and what eventually reaches global markets is filled with decisions that haven't been made yet by people who haven't fully committed yet in a political environment that is shifting faster than anyone anticipated. What was quietly announced near a small Saskatchewan town has already started intersecting with global trade policy, aluminum tariffs, North American manufacturing, the clean energy transition, and the long-running question of how Western economies reduce strategic dependency on concentrated overseas supply chains. And if even a fraction of what's projected actually materializes, what is currently just a point on a geological survey could become one of the most consequential nodes in the global materials economy, shaping industries that hundreds of millions of people interact with every single day without ever once thinking about where the raw materials actually come from. So here's what I genuinely want to hear from you on this one. If a deposit like Thor can actually sustain production for 2,000 years, do you think the world treats it as a shared resource that benefits everyone, Or does it quietly become a tightly controlled strategic asset shaped entirely by political power and economic pressure? Drop your take in the comments because I don't think there's one obvious answer here, and I'd love to know where you land on it. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time because this story is not going anywhere. It's only going to get bigger from here.